Good afternoon. My name is Jude Blanchette. I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I'm delighted to be hosting Aaron Friedberg today for a discussion about his really excellent, important new book, Getting China Wrong, which was literally just published yesterday by Polity. Aaron, for anyone who's been following strategic discourse about China, about great power relations, will know, of course, Aaron's work, which for decades I think has been amongst the most perceptive and sober in thinking about the bilateral relationship, what's driving it and where it's going. Aaron is currently a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He writes widely on these topics, and his new book really enters into an important fray of thinking about U.S.-China relations, what has been driving the U.S. position on China, what have we gotten wrong, what have we gotten right, and what do we do about it? So for the next 43 and a half minutes, we're going to have a discussion about the book, but also I want to use this opportunity to pick Aaron's brains about a range of issues, thinking about China, thinking about China's position right now in June of 2022. Is this in a strategic cul-de-sac? Is China facing new unprecedented challenges? Is China have some new opportunities? And what should the United States do about it? So, Aaron, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
I'll start with the obvious softball, which is why the book? Why now? What was the proximate reason you put pen to paper, and what was the ultimate reason?
I think the origins of the book were 3 or 4 years ago. There was an article in Foreign Affairs by Eli Ratner and Kurt Campbell, now high-ranking government officials, that made the argument first that engagement had failed, and secondly, something to the effect that we all got China wrong. I don't remember if that was the title, but it seemed to me that was the takeaway. And I agreed with the first, but I didn't agree with the second, because it seemed to me that not everyone had gotten it wrong, and so I wrote a short piece that talked about why and how some people had picked up on things that have become more evident over the last couple of years. But from that, I started thinking about why exactly had we done what we'd done? Why did we pursue the strategy that we did? And also, why did it fail? And thinking about that question in particular led me to look more at the Chinese side of the equation. So I came to think of this as a contest, a strategic contest between these two powers where we had a strategy and objectives. And the reason we are where we are, I think, is because China had a superior counter strategy that effectively defeated ours. So the more I thought about that, the more it seemed to me a suitable subject for a book, partly because in order to figure out where we're going, you have to understand how we've gotten where we are.
So you've been looking at Chinese strategy going back decades into the 90s. Looking over the broad sweep of, let's say, post-Mao or post-Tiananmen Chinese strategy, what are the continuities that you see over those, let's say, 3 or so decades? And if you can contrast those with under the Xi Jinping period, whether that's the full 10 years or since the 19th Party Congress, what sort of breaks do you see in the direction or substance of Chinese strategy?
I think I'd actually go back all the way to the beginning, so go back to Mao in 1949, because it seems to me there have been important continuities in Chinese strategy over this entire period regarding ends, where we've seen some flexibility and some discontinuity as regarding means. So I think the two objectives that each leading group has had over that period are, first, to maintain the absolute monopoly of political power of the Chinese Communist Party. To me, the key to understanding so much of what goes on in China and how it behaves externally is to understand the Leninist character of the CCP. So that's been number one, preserve the power of the CCP, and number two, to build up the power of China, to build China back into a major, if not the leading world power. It seems to me those two objectives have been constant throughout. But there have been variations regarding means and strategy. And the most important discontinuity is, I think, fairly obvious between Mao and Deng Xiaoping. So Deng really did change course. He introduced the market, although, as his associate Chen Yun put it, the market was like a bird that had to be kept in the cage. He backed away from some of the repression, particularly of the later Maoist period. He downplayed, to a certain degree, the Marxist-Leninist Maoist ideology and began to introduce an element of nationalism. And on the foreign policy front, he basically advised caution, the famous hide and bide 24-character strategy. It seems to me that those policies have been pursued with fluctuation and variation down to the present. The regime has had a set of policies for maintaining domestic control, a mix of repression, co-optation, indoctrination, and sometimes there's more of one and sometimes more of another. It's pursued economic policies that do involve some mix of party, state, and market, and sometimes the blend is a little bit different. The question, I think, is whether Xi Jinping really represents a fundamental break, whether he is something that's entirely new and different. And at least to this point, I think the answer to that question is no, that there's more continuity across all of those areas of policy. Yes, more repression. Yes, more nationalism. Probably the biggest shift has been towards a more assertive or aggressive foreign policy. But almost all of those changes, in fact, in every domain I talk about in the book, those changes began, I think, in the latter part of the Hu Jintao era. So it's not even the case that everything changed to that degree under Xi Jinping. So I think there's been a lot of continuity.
So I think you just, to some extent, anticipated and answered my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. A counterfactual, if we were to imagine we got into a time machine and went back to 2007, and for some reason Xi Jinping lost the campaign to become the next general secretary, and let's say it was, Li Keqiang, currently the number 2, managed to slip into that position. I guess on your part, how similar would China's subsequent trajectory be? Would you have still written this book? Would we still be sitting here? Would China's aspirations be much the same? How do you suspect the agency of whoever's in the captain's ship affects the direction of the ship?
Yeah, that's it's terrific and fascinating and unanswerable questions, but important ones because they get to the question of what is it exactly that's driving China in the directions it's going. I guess I would answer, or maybe avoid answering the question in the following way. What was the range of plausible outcomes if we go back to 2007? First, was it inevitable that we should have wound up where we are now, however we want to describe that? And I think the answer to that is clearly no. There's nothing that's inevitable in history. It may have been highly likely for various reasons that maybe we can talk about. What was really unlikely, I think, and should have been clear, at least at that point, if not somewhat before, is that China would move in the direction that our policy assumed it was, in fact, moving towards becoming a responsible stakeholder, a status quo satisfied power, moving progressively towards a truly market-based economy, and liberalizing politically. That, it seems to me, was highly unlikely. I would say it was almost ruled out. So the spectrum of possibilities was somewhat narrower. Now, within that, I think you could have had variation. I don't think you would have had anybody emerging who believed that China should be a multi-party democracy. I don't think you would have had anybody coming into power who believed that the party state should get out of the economy altogether. And I don't think there would have been anyone who said we should be satisfied with the international system as it currently exists. So there is a range, but I think it was rather narrow. Now, of course, the fact is that it was Xi Jinping. He did win out. And I suppose then the question is why? What were the factors that contributed to that? And it could be that there are sort of random events, the fall of Bo Xilai, perhaps. But I think, to me, it's a more satisfying answer would be to say Xi Jinping appears to have represented the views of a significant body of the upper levels of the CCP, who put him into power because they believed he was going to do things to correct problems that they were anticipating or beginning to see and to meet challenges. They didn't know all the details of what he was going to do, but I think he's there because he promised a way of securing the party and continuing the growth of China's power.
Yeah, it does seem, retrospectively, the the trajectory feels clearer than it felt in the moment. I mean, I was living in China in the late 1990s, in the period both leading up to and subsequent to the global financial crisis. And it's hard to think back about how pluralistic the discussion was on political futures back then. And maybe squaring the circle, your point, which I very much agree, that the party's instinct for survival is a very powerful shaper of events and how Beijing responds to things. Because I think you see these cycles where sort of an opening occurs, social, economic, political forces, as you would imagine in a country of 1.4 billion people, begin to run in directions that the party leadership isn't comfortable with. Problems will emerge in society, and then the party clamps shut. I wonder if something we're seeing now under Xi Jinping entering the 10th year of the 700 years he'll rule is he's decided that those cycles must collapse now, right? And that this expansion-contraction model that you've seen in Chinese politics since the 1980s was fundamentally undermining the governance resiliency of China. And that does feel different to me in terms of there isn't, we're now well into a 10-plus year cycle of real political conservatism, small c conservatism in China. And so I wonder if that is something new and likely to be enduring.
I think just a thought about the earlier period. It seems in retrospect that there were a number of things happening in various domains that people in the West interpreted as evidence that China was evolving in the direction that we would hope. So it wasn't that they were imagining things that weren't really there. There was some loosening up. The party did allow some criticism on the internet. It allowed NGOs to flourish in the early part of the 21st century. In my view, if you look back at that, those were experiments in co-optation, attempts to deal with the growing demands of an increasingly complex society, which were perceived pretty quickly not to have worked, and in fact to have produced undesirable and even dangerous consequences, which is why Hu himself began to shift away from them. And similarly on the economic side, the expectation after China entered the WTO was that it was now locked into a process that would be mutually or self-sustaining and reinforcing and carry it further and further down the line towards a market economy, when I don't think the core leadership ever believed that that was what they should be seeking to achieve. So they were changing the dimensions of the cage, but they weren't letting the bird free. Whether things are different now, I agree. Just the fact that she has felt the necessity to make it possible for himself to serve an indefinite period of time suggests that he believes that it's essential that he do so in order to keep the ship of state afloat. I do think that, again, if you look back, even though things might have appeared to us to have been moving in a positive direction, the leadership was constantly in a state of anxiety. Color revolutions, 2003, 2004, they dodged the worst effects of the global financial crisis, but they were bracing for mass unrest and unemployment. The Arab Spring, so there are a whole series of things that made them worried. And then, of course, corruption problems, and in the background, the knowledge that they had not yet formulated an alternative economic growth model. So there's a sense of crisis, I think, when Xi Jinping comes in 2012.
Yeah, this was something I was going to ask later on, but I'll just shunt it in now. Somewhat taking a slightly different shade of this, I think you're 100% right that the heuristics and the normative lens we were using to interpret dynamics in China, of course, very much fit our own, post-end of history narrative. It was comforting because it made it seem like there was a convergence on the U.S. model. And I think something we don't often talk about in discussions on, in the 1990s on PNTR and WTO succession, it was also good for business to talk ourselves into the idea that China was moving in this direction. It assuaged concerns over human rights because, look, let's get access to the market now. That'll solve these other unfortunate realities. I think to circle back to a point I just made, it's strikes me, though, it wasn't just, Western diplomats, Western governments, multinational corporations who didn't foresee where China was going. And as I was mentioning before we started to record here, the work that I'd done on the emergence of the Neo Maoist movement in the 1990s, what's so striking to me is you had this real, I use conservative in the Chinese sense of what we would call leftist or nationalist, statist. The emergence of this statist movement, which came into full flourishing in the early 2000s, was precisely in reaction to what they saw was a very clear direction of China heading towards a bourgeois liberal capitalist system. And their data points are WTO, which subsequently I think we've interpreted as China, sort of burrowing into the system and then letting its state capitalist model flourish. I think at the time in the 1990s, that wasn't, I don't think anyone had that stratagem yet, or at least it wasn't intuited by many. The three represents, which allows capitalists into the Communist Party. Again, subsequently you can read that as a co-optation, but it convinced real ideologues in the party that the CCP had lost its red colors. So it's not to say, I think your argument is right, but to me it adds some, it's more complicated to me at least in this narrative because it feels like either many of us got this wrong, including many Chinese conservatives and liberals, or it wasn't a clear trajectory, and in fact, as you mentioned, contingency intervened to basically move the needle. So, as we were joking before, if Bush Eli's wife hadn't poisoned Neil Haywood, would that sense of crisis have been more limited if the Arab Spring had never occurred, if the global financial crisis hadn't occurred? And as you say, that these are unanswerable, which is what makes this confounding. But nonetheless, I think it's just the possibility of change and the role of agency seems to be an important factor in China's trajectory.
Yes, and again, I think the question is what was the range of the possible? Just thinking about your point about the Neo-Maoists, it's possible that they were saying those things because they were involved or saw themselves involved as in a struggle for power, and it's not unheard of for people involved in such struggles to exaggerate the intentions of their opponents. From what I can tell, it doesn't seem that there was actually anybody in the upper reaches of the system who, in fact, intended to have China go all of that way. And of course, in the event, it didn't, and that seems in retrospect, at least in part, because the conservatives had an impact on the direction of policy. It wasn't the only one. What emerged was sort of a resultant of the collision of various vectors, but it had a tendency in one direction. And again, I think the most important guardrail is anything that is perceived as threatening the monopoly of the party. You're not even going to go near that. And that has implications, of course, for policy. For politics, it's more obvious. You're not really going to have multi-party elections. You may have village elections where you get to choose one or other CCP-appointed candidate. It's a little more subtle, I think, with regard to the economy, because there it's a question of whether you are stepping on a slippery slope, doing things that may, in fact, make it harder and harder to maintain control. And there, I think there were differing points of view. But in the event, people or the system tended to move towards this more conservative direction and maintain the party's position. Now, maybe in the long run, it'll turn out that having done that, set in motion a process that will ultimately bring the party down. We don't know that yet.
A very artful segue, because the next question I wanted to ask you was thinking about the current moment for China. We're on the cusp of the 20th Party Congress later this fall, which I think everyone is looking to, because with horror and fascination, we're likely to see Xi Jinping take a third term, which seems to fundamentally smash the understanding we've had of China's political system, imperfectly moving towards some sort of normalization of power transition, but also as part of its adaptive ability. Every 10 years you have a new leadership coterie come in, and that gives the possibility of course corrections or redirections. over the past 12 to 24 months, I think many analysts have noted what seemed to be increasing frequency of missteps from Beijing, or inability to see second and third order effects. So crush Hong Kong, which then it seems like they didn't quite understand how that would impact dynamics in Taiwan, for example. There seemed to be rising disillusionment with China amongst many countries in the, in not only sort of in the West, but even polling data coming out of Southeast Asia is showing sort of rising concerns about China's economic clout. You had mentioned at the top of this and in the book how you felt like China had adopted a strategy which bested ours. I want to ask do you still feel that China has a superior strategy, or do you see any signs now that slowing economic growth, a more hostile international order which limits China's play space, and now this leadership galloping towards some form of dictatorship might undermine China's strategic advantages?
Well, I think it certainly could, and it may well. We're not, it's hard to know for sure just the direction in which things are going, but we do have a tendency, I think, to see certain things happening and jump to conclusions. And say, this must be self-defeating. Wolf warrior diplomacy, they're undermining their position. Or BRI, they've overspent and they're going to have to pull back, or they've been too aggressive. It seems to me, though, that these initiatives will be self-defeating if we defeat them. They're not going to defeat themselves. And so it depends in large part on what we do. It's certainly possible if people were to fold, if China were to be successful in dividing us from our allies and so on, that it could be successful by some definition. Having said that, I agree that there are a lot of indications recently that the Chinese leadership is making decisions that are producing pretty quickly negative effects. But really, it's not just the last 18 or 24 months. I think you have to go back at least to the global financial crisis and the start of the more assertive posture on maritime disputes, or 2014, the island construction program, or 2015, Made in China 2025 document. There have been a series of things that have happened that I think have gradually and now more rapidly woken people up and caused alarm. So then the question is why? Why is China behaving in this way? Is it because they've miscalculated, or is there something about the math, the way they're doing that calculation, that perhaps we don't understand? And I have a hypothesis about this. I'm not sure that it's right, but I think you may have to go back to 2002. So the initiation of the so-called 20-year period of strategic opportunity that followed China's entry into the WTO, and very importantly followed the 9/11 attacks. And I think the CCP leadership concluded that it would have 2 decades in which to grow and expand its power and its influence, unmolested by the United States, because the United States would be preoccupied with these other problems, and also because economic ties would be beneficial to at least some important groups in American society. So they believed they had this window. If you look at the debate in 2012 about the 10-year dividing line and whether the period of opportunity is going to be continued, the conclusion is, yes, of course it's going to be continued, because if it wasn't, the party would have been wrong, and the party can't be wrong. But things are going to become more contentious. We're going to face an increasingly difficult and challenging environment. And the reason for that is not anything that we're doing wrong, but the fact that the West, the United States, is going to be increasingly alarmed by and jealous of our success. And they will do more and more to try to hold us down and contain us. And the only response to that can be to push ahead with even greater force. And I think that's the logic that underpins much of this aggressive behavior. In a sense, I think the Chinese may have been surprised by Donald Trump and his pugnaciousness and the particular form that it took, but I don't think they were shocked by a turn in relations with the United States towards a more open rivalry. They'd been expecting it. Maybe it came a few years early. The prediction was off by a few years. It started in 2016 instead of 2022, but they've been expecting it. And unfortunately, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the harder they push now, the stronger the resistance.
Yeah, on the hide and bide that you mentioned earlier, I think, it seems to me, of course, that was a temporary strategy until China felt it had sufficient military capabilities and or its primary strategic competitor was itself facing some headwinds, and it was a time to push forward. I do wonder, this will be one of those we may not know for 10 years ago, was Xi Jinping right to abandon that? Because it was always going to be a painful transition once you went from a more supplicant position, which I think in the discourse in China, the challenge they always faced was, yes, you can stay in a hide and bide posture, which gives you more space to be focusing on economic development, but you allow really entering into the arena of shaping global governance to pass you by.
Right.
And I think that was their calculation was, and you see Xi Jinping writing about this very early in his tenure, we've got these new emerging technologies that we need to be on the ground floor of writing the rules of the road for these, and also capturing some of the sort of real advanced capabilities. And I think they felt like the 20th century global governance was running out of gas, and so it was a appropriate moment. But I suppose that's one of those, it's hard to know if he was right or wrong in that. Certainly we're thinking about China as a pacing threat precisely because it's really advanced its interests. So,
yeah, I think in retrospect it will appear that it was premature in a variety of different domains. So technological self-reliance. Why is it over the last few years that we've started to impose export controls that not only we but other countries, Europe and Asia, have put limits on Chinese direct investment and become much more concerned about the nature of their technology promotion and industrial policies? It's because China has been pushing so hard to acquire those technologies, and there are, I think, reasons for that perhaps we can talk about, or in the region, building these islands. What exactly did that accomplish for them? But it began a process of re-examination of their intentions. So it may turn out that it was premature. Now I think they feel that they're in no man's land. So they didn't make it across. They didn't make it all the way across, in part because what they did sent up a big flare and illuminated what was going on. And now, do they turn back, or do they run faster to try to get across? I think they run faster. If you look at some of the elements of this, it's striking how close they actually came to achieving some of their objectives. I'm thinking of the technology domain. And you wonder if they had been able to keep quiet about some of this stuff. Look how close they got to having Huawei build the 5G networks, not only in the developing world, but in much of the advanced industrial world. We seem to have caught on to the significance of that and the implications very, very late in the game. So perhaps they would have been wiser to play it down. Then the question again becomes, why didn't they? And I think part of the answer must have to do with the other pieces of Xi Jinping's kind of internal strategy, and in particular, the increased emphasis on nationalism, the elevation of nationalism, it seems to me, to really this central place in China's ideology, in practice, if not in theory, and the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and achieving the China dream, and all of that, I think, implied a much more sort of forceful Chinese presence in the world, and that is useful in part to mobilize and sustain popular support. So maybe he felt he had to do some of these things in order to keep people on his side.
I wanted to turn now to the U.S. and thinking about U.S. strategy on China. One of the arguments of those who are saying that, sure, we might have gotten some elements wrong, but in the moment and forward-looking, it was never as clear precisely where China is going. I wanted to ask you, thinking back, however long a time period you want, but since the normalization of relations, what were the key moments or junction points where you think we should have or could have foreseen where China was going and taken different steps. I don't know where we sliced the salami. Is WTO accession, should that have been seen to be a mistake from the vantage point of 1996, for example? I just wanted to hear you think about where were the periods where we should have made different calls?
Right. I don't know that there's one decisive date. You do have to start with the assumptions that took shape between Tiananmen, basically, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, so the early 1990s, and the abandonment or end of a strategy for dealing with China, which had been intended primarily to build up its power to counter the power of the Soviet Union, to a new rationale for a close relationship, and in particular a close economic relationship with China, which did have these expectations. Welcome China into the international system, and it's going to become a responsible stakeholder. That term emerged somewhat later. Welcome China into the global economic system, and it's going to move towards a true liberal market economy. And although some people, I think, are rewriting history a little bit and saying they didn't say this, eventually we're going to have succeeded in setting in motion forces that will cause China to liberalize politically. So I think it's clear now that none of those things has happened. But when should it have been clear that that wasn't what was going on? And I think there were probably different dates for different parts of that. The military piece of it started, I think, to become quite clear by the end of the 1990s. The early signs of the emergence of the so-called anti-access area denial strategy, which is now causing us such headaches. I think we would have paid much more attention to it and probably have dealt with it more effectively and not been as far behind as we are now in responding to it, if not for 9/11. That really did knock the Defense Department, the country, off course, and took a lot of attention and energy away from the focus on the Chinese military buildup, which continued. And it's not that people totally ignored it, but it didn't get the attention at the highest levels that it deserved. In the economic domain, I think it's understandable why people thought that, particularly after WTO accession, there would be these irresistible forces that were driving China towards a more market-based economy. So when exactly did it become clear that that was not what was happening? It seems like there was, looking back, there was evidence almost immediately when Hu Jintao comes in of some movement away from what might have been a strategy that could have taken China more in that direction. And it accumulated over time, but perhaps it didn't become clear until later in the decade. I guess I would say, if I was forced, give people, I don't know, a C-, a passing grade, not failing because these are difficult problems, until you get to the second term of the Obama administration. I think from 2012, so when Xi Jinping comes to power, it should have been clear, because he was saying in so many words what he intended to do in almost all of these domains, and yet for most of that time we didn't respond. And again, it's for various reasons: preoccupation with the Middle East again, the first Ukraine war, but we didn't respond adequately. One of the things about not responding adequately, and I don't blame it all on the Obama administration, I think it goes all the way back, is that when you begin to respond, when you begin to realize that your strategy has not worked, and you find that you're behind, there's a tendency to scramble, and of course there's a risk that the other side may miscalculate, and you increase the risk of conflict. And there's also a danger that you can overreact and do things that perhaps, if you had taken a more measured approach, you wouldn't feel compelled to do.
I wanted to ask, one of the things that seems to be hampering U.S. strategy on China is an inability to articulate a meaningful vision of victory or end here. Even, and again, not casting aspersions, but when you just think about national security strategies, even Secretary of State Blinken's speech, we're very much focused on a process of competition.
Right.
But I still struggle to articulate convincingly to myself, what sort of competition are we in? What does the finish line look like? I also struggle to understand an offensive component of our strategy. It seems to me that we feel like we've scored an offensive victory when we block one of China's shots. But of course, you can block shots, indefinitely. They just have to make one in unless you can score. But I'm not sure I can articulate what scoring would look like for us.
Right.
So I wanted to ask if you, do you think about this in terms of what an ultimate objective should be vis-a-vis China or our China strategy? Some of these I would imagine we're moving towards, but we don't articulate. It seems to me that there is some sort of, and I don't mean this in a normative sense or pejorative sense, some sort of containment, neo-containment strategy that is being formed. China would call it an encirclement strategy. It seems there, and this was coming out in the late Trump administration in some of the speeches, really our vision of victory was the collapse of the Communist Party and a new sort of governing regime that would come in. What sort of end goal do you position for our China strategy?
It's impossible really to have a strategy that deserves the name without identifying some kind of objective. And whatever its strengths and weaknesses, the strategy that we were pursuing for the 30 years or so after the end of the Cold War did have a pretty clearly articulated objective. And many people, I think most people in Washington, I would say, it seems in both political parties have come to the conclusion that that strategy hasn't worked and that objective is not within reach, but it's not clear what the substitute for it is. Now, it may be that it's difficult to talk about those things for a variety of reasons, but it may also be that we should be thinking about this not so much as victory, so the theory of victory and the signing of the surrender on the deck of the Missouri, but as something more of a process. So I would say, and this is perhaps, this is less satisfying rhetorically, first and foremost, we need to defend ourselves better than we've been doing. As you say, blocking shots, it's, sometimes we're getting to the net after the puck has gone in. That's the way Solomon Islands sort of looks to me. The game's not over. We need to do a better job of defending ourselves, of strengthening our position across an array of domains to prevent the penetration and exploitation of our economies and societies by the CCP, and to deter and discourage coercion or aggression. We've got a lot of work to do, I think, to get to a stronger position. So that's first. I think if we're successful in that regard, what we're looking at is a stalemate where we've kind of stabilized the situation and we are not as concerned as we are currently about China tipping the balance of military power, gaining economic advantage, and extending its influence around the world. It will not be, peace, love, and understanding. It'll be a kind of Cold War, and it will be sort of dynamically stable. In the course of doing that, it seems to me, we have to defeat the policies that the current CCP regime has been pursuing. We have to demonstrate in various ways that they can't succeed in achieving their objectives by proceeding in the way that they are, both in their foreign policy and their domestic policies. Because it's only if we can do that that there's any hope that either the current leadership, or I would suspect more likely some future leading group, might re-examine the policies that are currently being pursued. So that's the sort of medium-range goal. We would hope once we reach this point of stalemate and we were able to impose costs on the CCP regime, that we would compel them to reconsider what they're doing. As far as the ultimate goal is concerned, in my view, the objective of the original strategy of engagement was not the wrong one. The idea that it would be a good thing for the Chinese people, it would be a good thing for the world if China had a more liberal regime, I think is true. I think it's still true. We don't have the capacity to make that happen through any direct means, and there are reasons why we might prefer not to say that in so many words. But really, I think the objective of our strategy in the long run, or the thing towards which we should be working, is, to paraphrase George Kennan from his 47X article, the gradual mellowing or eventual breakup of CCP power, because I don't think we can live comfortably in a world where a very powerful China is governed by a regime that resembles the current Chinese regime. And it may take a long time to get there, but I think that is the ultimate goal towards which we should be working.
On the, I don't know, we're all searching for the appropriate framework or historical analogy, and all historical analogies are imperfect. But thinking about, as you just mentioned, trying to arrive at some sort of equilibrium Cold War, maybe an early 70s Cold War. The challenge is, how do we get to a early 70s Cold War détente without a 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis? I can't go a day in Washington without talking about Taiwan. I was going to try to avoid it today, but just given where it's hard to think about how do we overcome potential crisis points and get to a early 70s more mellow détente version of Cold War without thinking what is our, at least now, most likely Cuban Missile Crisis, and that is thinking about Taiwan. We only have a few minutes left. This is an unfair question to pitch at the very end, but I wanted to ask you how you are conceptualizing Taiwan in terms of what are we right now competing over. The conversation in DC, much to my frustration, immediately gets to invasion scenarios, immediately gets to how many beach landing sites does the PLA have. I guess my own bias is I tend to think that Beijing is thinking about Taiwan first in a political context, of which military capabilities are a critical component and is a tool in the toolkit. How do you think about the issue of Taiwan? Where do you stand on the immediacy or not of crisis? And any thoughts on how do we avoid 1962 as we try to achieve a stalemate?
Well, since it's a difficult question and we only have a few minutes left.
You can punt.
I'm not going to punt completely, but I just wanted to say something generally, which is we have to be willing to endure some tension and friction in order to get to this more satisfactory equilibrium. If we allow ourselves to be pushed back by the merest hint of the possibility of conflict, we're going to get into a worse and worse position. I mean, my concern now, as regards the likelihood of conflict, is more about CCP leadership miscalculating the resolve of the United States than it is about our somehow provoking them into doing something that they might not otherwise do. And I think we've got a ways to go before we get to that point. But we're sort of out of practice in that regard, and I think we would generally prefer that everything be calm. And this idea that the administration has expressed of being able to divide the relationship into these, I forget what they are now, the different categories, I don't,
neatly demarcated.
Yes, we'll be nice to you about this, but then we'll arm wrestle with you about that. I just don't think that that's possible. There's so much interplay between all of those domains, and we're going to have to accept it. If I could, just one other thing before I get to the impossible questions about Taiwan. Thinking about stalemate or equilibrium, you mentioned the Soviet Union, and we were talking earlier about China's problems and the likelihood that it's entering into a period of much slower growth, which I think is inevitable at this point. Thinking back about the Soviet Union was experiencing slow growth, we realize now in retrospect, for 20 or 30 years before it got to the point where the system completely failed. It experienced a long period of stagnation and frustration. And if we had been helping it out in various ways, perhaps it would still exist. I think we may be headed towards something similar with China. About Taiwan, it is obviously the flashpoint, and there's reason to be concerned about it. And I guess I'm of two minds about it. I can see that there is a danger in the relatively near term of some miscalculation and an initiation of military conflict. I think the way in which that has been discussed here may be colored a bit too much by the purely military considerations of our military people, whose job it is to focus on those factors. So I forget which admiral it was, but
Phil Davidson.
Phil Davidson. So 2007.
2027.
2027, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Why did he say that? I think it probably had to do with, our understanding of the timelines for the development of various Chinese capabilities. Not we have some secret inside information that tells us that Xi Jinping is thinking about pressing the button. So I think the threshold there is higher than perhaps the current discussion suggests, if only because it seems to me, however they look at the military balance, and they have reason to be concerned about their capabilities. I think they did before. Maybe they have more after Ukraine. They're a little more inclined to question whether they can do all the things they say they want to do. This would be an enormous roll of the dice. And it's hard for me to see, at least again, the current leadership doing that unless it felt that it was completely cornered and had no other choice. It's always possible to kick the can down the road and say, well, we wanted to do it by then, but we're going to take a longer view. And if we are smart about it, and if we do the things we need to do to help Taiwan defend itself and to enhance our own capabilities and those of our allies in the region, maybe we can achieve that. We can push it further down the line. What worries me a little bit now is that we're sort of talking tough, and members of Congress are going out to Taiwan and they want to pass bills that declare one thing and another. But I'm not convinced that we're actually doing enough of the nitty-gritty work to strengthen our military position and to get Taiwan to strengthen its defenses. I guess I wish we were doing more of that, doing it faster and talking about it less.
Unfortunately, we scheduled this for 45 minutes. I feel like we should have done 90, because I was just been writing down questions I wanted to ask you about Russia, China. I wanted to ask you more questions about Taiwan, but folks will have to buy the book to get answers to these and many more questions. But just want to thank you for your time. Can't recommend the book enough. I would hold it up, but as I showed Aaron, my son has written on marker all over the book, so it's not a good sales pitch to hold that up. But Getting China Wrong is available now from Polity, who I have to say, Polity is putting out some of the best books on China, and this is just the latest in this series of great work that they're doing. So thank you very much for your time, and
thank you.
Look forward to continuing the conversation.
I enjoyed it. I like the cover that Polity came up with, and I like your son's too.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining.